the next series of slides, these are about, if you're looking at the project builder, all of those other columns in your M&E monitoring, evaluation, and learning plan that you need to think about for each of your indicators. The first being, who is responsible for the data? You know, we've talked about how important it is for monitoring and evaluation to be really a learning experience, that it be integrated into your project plan, which means the people who are going to be involved in data collection, data analysis, and all of that need to know that that's part of their role, whether it's volunteers or staff. But who's going to collect the data, and thinking about who are the right people to be collecting the data. How are the communities themselves or beneficiaries going to be participating and engaged in the data collection process, not just as respondents or informants, but actually in designing and participating in the data collection. Once the data has been collected, who's responsible for storing, compiling, maintaining a database, however it is you're going to do that. Once it's compiled, who's responsible for doing the analysis? Once the analysis is complete, who's responsible for sharing learnings or discussing the information so that you can pull out learnings? Who's responsible for any decision making that you need to do around changes to the project, course corrections if required? And who's responsible for communicating back out once those decisions have been made. So this is going to look very different depending on the project. In a very small project, it might in fact be one person who's responsible for monitoring and evaluation and learning, and then works with the team and integrates that in along the way and engages the community. It could be a team of people. It could be that everyone on the project team has a responsibility and participates in different parts of the process. But you're going to want to think that through right from the outset, because I can tell you, if it's not explicitly in someone's work plan, it won't happen. And it'll get forgotten as you get busy with implementing activities. And then you get to a point where you're supposed to make decisions or have like a midline check-in, and you don't have the data. And that's a situation you can avoid very easily by making sure that it's in people's work plans. It's whether it's a staff person, it's in their contract, it's in what you communicate to stakeholders and beneficiaries right from the get-go, that that's part of participation and engaging in the project. The next consideration is around timing and frequency. So when is the right time to collect these different pieces of data, and how frequently are you going to collect the data? Are you going to use mobile to check in with a farmer every month to ask them what was their income that month? Are you going to ask them every quarter? Are you going to ask them baseline, midline, endline? Like, how often do you need to collect the data, and when are you going to do that? If it's a post-training survey, obviously you're going to do that immediately following the training. I think it's important to think about, especially if you're working on a small budget, if you're a small organization, you don't want to create additional work if you don't have to, right? So much like we talked about with your data collection tools, you know, if you can piggyback on data that's already being collected for another purpose and use that to evaluate your indicators, fantastic. If you can use your monitoring and evaluation data collection on other activities that are already planned and going to be taking place, all the better. So if you're traveling to the community to do a training, could you also, while you're there, do some of the data collection? So think about how you can plan your calendar or your timeline for monitoring and evaluation and learning in relation to your activity implementation timeline. And make sure that part of what you're planning for in your time is also the time that you're going to spend reviewing the data, discussing learnings, and making decisions about course corrections or improvements you can make to the project. My personal rule of thumb, and this is, again, there is no right answer to any of this. It really depends on your project, and it depends on the people who are involved in your monitoring and evaluation plan. But for me, unless frequency is prescribed by an outside funder, that they require quarterly, for example. I generally, on a small project, especially one that's say a year or even anything less than 2 years, for most data, I would suggest that baseline and midline, so the middle point of the project and end line, is going to be okay. For your, say, intermediate level indicators, you got to allow time for change to take place before you can track whether it's taken place. If for anything that's longer, you might want to do annual data collection across the board. Recognizing too, as I said, with things like training evaluations and that, you are going to get some touch points in between your sort of major thrusts of data collection. And then how is the data going to be collected? So you've got in the plan that you've got surveys. That's fine. Who's going to design the survey? When does that take place? How are the surveys going to be deployed? Are you using pen and paper and then data entry later? Are you going to collect surveys on a digital platform, on a tablet, for example, so that the data is already entered into a system? There's lots of choices to be made, and you're going to want to think through those choices well in advance and actually put those right into your monitoring and evaluation plan so that you have time and you're prepared to purchase items or to set up your spreadsheets or whatever, your surveys online, whatever you're going to do. I mentioned sort of there's some free options. Google Forms is actually pretty effective and easy to use and can be deployed on a tablet or a smartphone quite easily to collect some basic data. There's also a tool out there, and you should write this down. It's called Kobo Toolbox. And if you Google that online, you'll see it is free for all NGOs internationally to use. And the nice thing about it is it works sort of like a Google Forms, right? Where you would set up surveys or questionnaires, and it could be long answer, it could be multiple choice. There's lots of different options for the kinds of questions you ask. The nice thing about Kobo is that you do not need to be connected to the internet in order to collect data using the Kobo tool. So you could be in a community space that does not have internet connection with a tablet or a smartphone that has the survey or the form open, and you can ask people to fill it out and hit enter, and your tablet or your digital device will store that data locally. And then once you reconnect to the internet, that data will get uploaded into the cloud and compiled with all the other data you've collected. So that's a really handy free tool that you can use. And of course, it can replace paper and pen and saves a lot of time between collecting data and then data entry later, because it's all already going to be there and it will export nicely into an Excel spreadsheet for roll-up and analysis. The other question around the how is how data is going to be stored and accessed. So who needs to be accessing the data? Keeping in mind that some of the data you're collecting might be private information or highly personal information. So you're going to want to limit who has access to the data. You're going to want to make sure you're storing data in a way that is secured. And you have version control so that you don't end up with funny numbers or things getting lost in numbers. So thinking about that side of the data as well. Is it in Excel? Is it in another database? Who owns it? Where can people access it? Do all the people who need access have access? And then, of course, this communication piece, which we've touched on all the way through. But community, I just really want to drive it home. Community participation is really crucial to success, and it's crucial to ensuring that you get accurate, reliable data. They can participate in all aspects of your monitoring and evaluation plan, from defining what success looks like and informing indicators, to helping you to assess what achievable, realistic targets might be, to providing the data that you need against those targets, for providing feedback and input and stories and context that helps you to understand the data. Sometimes even just doing focus groups with a variety of stakeholders to say, here's what we found out. at midline, what does this mean to you? What do you think the key takeaways from this should be? What should we be learning? You're going to find out things that you might not have occurred to you working from the implementer's perspective. So I really encourage you to think about how you can integrate a variety of stakeholders into the process right the way through. So here's a quick glance at the monitoring and evaluation plan, what it looks like in the project builder when you've got all of these pieces, your indicator, target, your data source, that's the tools, how you're going to collect the data, frequency, and responsibility, so that you can see sort of all of the pieces are laid out in advance, which means it's easy to then integrate into your work plan and your project, your timelines, and roles and responsibilities from the outset. So then the learning piece, don't ever want to forget about the learning piece, right? So thinking about how you're going to do your analysis and learning as well. So you've got the data, but who's responsible for, and how is it going to work once you're looking at the data? Who's doing the analysis? Who's involved in the conversations about what the data means? Which tools and formats are you going to use to present your findings for learning? Is it a report that's going to be shared out? Is it a slide deck? Is it everybody looking at the raw data and having a team meeting and discussing what they're seeing? Again, thinking about the participatory piece around who's involved. So back to our sample indicator here. So let's say in this scenario, that the goal was that 70% of the participating farmers would have an improved monthly income of at least X% that we've set for the target. And the target was 70%. At midline, so halfway through the project, we're at 50%. What questions might arise if you're looking at that data? And what are the questions you would want to be asking or considering to understand what you need to take away from that data? I mean, obviously, it's a bit of a strange question because we have no other context and it's a completely made up scenario. But would 50% halfway through the project, would you look at that and think, oh, we're making good progress? Or would you see that as, oh no, we're only at 50%, we need to get at 70? Well, but what are the kinds of things you would want to think about? No wrong answers here. Paul.
Well, I would say that certainly at this time of COVID, that you couldn't give yourself a hard time if you've gotten to 50% and your target was 70, right? I mean, if everything was going well and there was no reason why it couldn't do better, then you might be hard on yourself. But at this time of year, with all these the locusts and everything else, you got to go, well, we're lucky we get that far.
Yeah. I can get maybe.
You want to caution the corrective measure that you will use so that at least you're able to achieve that. And if it is something that is out of your, out of your scope, or you cannot be able to achieve, as Paul has mentioned, maybe because of a lockdown situation like we just had, then you may want to, you may want to inform the donor that we anticipate we may not be able to achieve this. So these are some of the questions, like, do you think you'll be able to achieve? Is it achievable? Do you want to revise, or do you want to? What are the corrective measures that you can take so that you're able to achieve?
Yep. I have a couple I'll throw out there. For me, the first thing I would want to know is how close to that achieving that target are the other farmers. So did all the other farmers, are their monthly incomes not improving at all? Or had they also improved, but not quite at that target of the at least X%? So I would want to know how close you actually are to reaching the 70% achievement of the target before, and then go from there in terms of whether course correction needs to be. You might find out, you know what, probably we're going to achieve 70% next month because everyone's really close. I would actually probably at midline, being this close to the achievement of the target, I might question whether the target is too low, that maybe it's been a little too easy to get to that target. It's also maybe a good time to ask the question of, okay, so you've achieved that level of income. Has it actually improved your livelihood? Has it improved your daily life enough? Or is that target not high enough to actually achieve the change we're looking for the household? That spark anybody else? Anybody else have a thought they would like to share? No? Okay. So then, yeah, thinking through then the learning piece. So you got your data, you start asking questions, you analyze it, you maybe go out and ask for some additional input or information from your stakeholders. Then how do you make decisions? Okay, in some cases that might be prescribed for you, like a funder, for example, might have it in their contract with you that they get to approve any changes to the project plan or budget. That's one thing to be considered. But generally speaking, internally, how do you make decisions around course corrections or changes that you need to make to a project? Who is the final authority, I guess, on those decisions? Who needs to be part of those discussions around decision making? If you're making changes to your project implementation plan, keeping in mind that you're going to need to make some changes to your monitoring and evaluation and learning plan as well. How are you going to monitor whether the changes you make are effective, right? So you're going to think through how you're going to monitor that change now, in addition to what you've already built into your monitoring and evaluation and learning plan. And how are you going to communicate back out to all the stakeholders about the changes you're making? And I think that's a really important piece. And especially if you are making a course correction and you've learned a lesson, if you can share that back out with your beneficiary stakeholders, your other community stakeholders, that's going to be incredibly valuable to your future data collection as well, right? They say, oh, well, we provided this feedback and this tangible change is taking place, then we're even more motivated to want to be contributing and active as part of the monitoring and evaluation and learning process as we move forward. I saw something in the chat. Did someone have something?
Yes, a question is, what about the collection of data in a lockdown situation? So if you have to be going to collect data physically,
yep.
What do you do if that's compromised?
Yeah, so if you, depending on the environment that you're working in, you may be able to pivot to digital data collection. So for example, you could send out a link using a text message or like an SMS, and then people could then click the link and provide their input or answers to the questions that way. You may have to just completely change the schedule. You may have to think creatively about how to conduct qualitative research in a way that's not dependent on, say, bringing groups of people together for discussion. But definitely, yeah, the inability to travel to communities, inability to gather is going to have huge implications, and you'll definitely need to make accommodations. And it may even just be a waited out. It might say, well, we were intending to do monthly or quarterly data collection, but given all of the precautions that need to be taken place, we're going to scale that back and we're going to do semi-annual or baseline, midline, endline only, because data collection itself will become more difficult and time consuming. The other thing you might need to think about on that, and it would probably apply to part of the project implementation as well, is, are there things like masks, for example, that you would need to provide to all of the stakeholders that you're asking to participate so that they can do so safely? How can you could you do a focus group while socially distancing outside? In some contexts, the answer is probably yes. In others, it might be no, that's not feasible, and you would need to scale back to do one-on-one interviews, for example. If you are working in a very participatory way, don't forget, it doesn't necessarily need to be you traveling to a community to be able to do data collection. If you've got local stakeholders involved, data collection and discussion could still take place. It just means that you're not there in person to do it. And maybe you're participating in a different way, or maybe you're relying on a community partner or stakeholders to do some of the data collection for the project on behalf of all of you.